Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Yekaterinburg, a city known for three things: the execution of Russia's last Tsar, the rise of Boris Yeltsin, and a legacy of organized crime that once defined post-Soviet Russia. That criminal era faded by the early 2000s, but now Yekaterinburg is in the headlines again, and this time the story is political. In recent days, Russian authorities carried out a sweeping police operation. Over 50 people were arrested, all of them either ethnic Azerbaijanis or Russian citizens of Azerbaijani descent. The arrests were violent. Footage shows people being beaten, dragged from their homes, and left injured. 2 men later died in custody. But these alleged crimes that led to the arrests date back more than 20 years. So, why now? Well, some say it's a coincidence, others believe the timing is calculated. But what is clear is that this has caused a serious rupture between Moscow and Baku, one many are calling a full-blown diplomatic break. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
What began as a diplomatic protest has evolved into a full-blown estrangement. A week after the deadly police raids in Yekaterinburg left 2 Azerbaijani men dead, Baku now has forensic proof. The victims were not just arrested, they were beaten to death. And with that, Azerbaijan is no longer just outrage, it's unshackling itself from Moscow. Moscow first framed the crackdown as part of a cold case murder probe, suggesting links to killings from the early 2000s. A Yekaterinburg court has since ordered 6 Azerbaijani-born suspects to pre-trial detention, but the charges remain murky, the timing political, and the silence around the deaths deafening. The Russian investigative committee attempted to downplay it, suggesting heart failure and denying responsibility. But now Baku's own autopsy says otherwise. Skull hemorrhages, crushed ribs, signs of prolonged blunt force trauma. The health ministry did not mince words, and this time they brought receipts.
After opening of a skull, the hemorrhages into solid and soft brain tissue have been detected. A blunt trauma of chest has been accompanied by multiple displaced fractures of ribs on both sides along several anatomic lines.
But the story now stretches beyond police brutality. Baku is seizing the moment to distance itself from Moscow, diplomatically, economically, and even in matters of security. Gone are the days when Azerbaijan quietly tolerated Russian dominance in the South Caucasus. These days, it is pivoting fast towards Turkey, towards China, and above all, towards independence. The signs are multiplying. Azerbaijani MPs refused to travel to Moscow for talks. Cultural events were scrapped. And now, Baku is openly confronting Russian soft power. Raids on Sputnik's local office sent a clear message: your propaganda has no place here. And confirmed reports even suggest 2 undercover FSB agents were detained. It is not the first blow to the relationship. When Russia's air defense mistakenly downed an Azerbaijani passenger plane last December, 38 lives were lost. Putin apologized, but never accepted blame. And Azerbaijan never truly forgave. This week's events seem to have tipped the scales for good. For years, Moscow relied on regional loyalty to survive its geopolitical isolation. But in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, loyalty is fraying. Baku has options, and it's using them. The days of automatic deference to the Kremlin may be over. Blood in Yekaterinburg, silence in Moscow, and the resolve in Baku. Azerbaijan isn't just waiting for apologies anymore. It is writing its own rules.
And now let's zone in on the east-plaining portion of our show. In the South Caucasus, Russia and Turkey have long competed for influence. But standing between them is Azerbaijan, quietly gaining power and building leverage. As Ankara and Moscow jostle for control, Baku is playing on both sides. And here's how that works.
Since the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, Russia and Turkey have maintained an uneasy partnership. Together they operate a joint monitoring center near Agdam to oversee the ceasefire. Turkish sappers clear mines, Russian officers patrol the zone. On the surface, it's cooperation, but beneath it, a silent struggle for dominance. That same year, Turkey deepened its alliance with Azerbaijan by signing the Shusha Declaration. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It paved the way for joint arms production, military training, and even a Turkish consulate in Shusha, right in the heart of the reclaimed territories. At the core of this alliance is the proposed Zangezur corridor, strategic route connecting Turkey to the Caspian via Azerbaijan, bypassing Armenia and extending Ankar's reach into Central Asia. But Azerbaijan hasn't picked a side. It's playing both. While buying spare parts and maintaining Soviet-era weapons from Russia, Baku is simultaneously scaling up joint drone and ammunition production with Turkey. It's a two-front strategy, Russian legacy systems and Turkish modernization, all under Azerbaijan's control. This balancing act has started to raise alarms. Moscow sees Turkey's growing military expansions as direct threat. Kremlin spokesmen have labeled it as destabilizing. Meanwhile, Turkey views Russia's long-standing presence in the Caucasus as a roadblock to deeper regional integration with the Turkic world. And yet, as the two powers compete, Azerbaijan benefits. It has modernized its armed forces, strengthened its grip on post-war territories, and expanded access to energy and transport routes. Even the Russian-Turkish Monitoring Center, designed to limit conflict, now serves to legitimize Baku's growing dominance in the region.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. What Russia once considered its unshakable backyard is no longer under its control. Miscalculation, costly war in Ukraine, and growing frustration from former allies have chipped away at Moscow's influence in the South Caucasus. Armenia has drifted out of orbit, and Azerbaijan, once cautiously cooperative, is now asserting its independence more openly. The Yekaterinburg crackdown, sudden, violent, and targeted, was meant to signal authority. Instead, it revealed just how fragile that authority has become. Trust, especially from Baku, has all but evaporated. And without trust, Moscow risks losing more than just political influence. It risks losing its economic lifeline. Azerbaijan has quietly become one of Russia's key routes for bypassing Western sanctions through energy flows, trade corridors, and logistics hubs. But that cooperation only works if Baku sees Moscow as a stable partner. The violence in Yekaterinburg may have changed that. If Azerbaijan pulls back, Russia could find itself more isolated than ever, forced to lean harder on Beijing, a position Putin has tried to avoid. For Moscow, this isn't just about damaged diplomacy, it's also about survival. As Russia loses its footing, Turkey sees an opening. Ankara is deepening ties with Baku, building new influence in a region where Moscow once called the shots. Now, the question is, how long can Azerbaijan keep balancing? Playing both sides has worked until now, but soon Baku may have to choose. And if it does, the fragile power balance in the South Caucasus could shift for good. Azerbaijan, once caught between empires, is now navigating them with skill, and for the moment, it seems to be winning. One thing is clear, Baku's day of quiet diplomacy are over, and now it's making noise. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Mahammad Mammadov, research fellow from the Topchubashov Center of Tartu. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me.
So today we are going to continue to explore the diplomatic rift between Russia and Azerbaijan. We've talked extensively about how it came to be, but we're more curious about where Azerbaijan go from here and what is going to be filling that diplomatic vacuum. What's your take on where Azerbaijan might turn to now that the diplomatic relation with Russia is deteriorating fast?
Yeah, first of all, what we see right now is that Azerbaijani government is not interested in a long-term diplomatic crisis with Russia. So that's why I'm sure that there will be some positive responses to outreach, what we have been seeing from Russia in recent days. Foreign ministry spokesperson Dmitry Peskov's overtures to Azerbaijani side that Russia is not a threat to Azerbaijan, and some positive sides from the Russian side shows that Russia is not also interested in the prolongation of the current crisis. So that's why I think that Azerbaijani side will reciprocate, because it's not in Azerbaijan's long-term interest to have diplomatic crisis with Russia. But if we see that Russian side in this or that way prolongs the crisis, Azerbaijan can use its multifaceted group of alliances and diplomatic partnerships to balance Russia's increasing pressure over this issue.
So do you think Azerbaijan has kind of more flexibility when it comes to reaching out to different international partners, or do you think Russia still has such a strong grip over it? Like you mentioned, both sides doesn't seem to want to prolong this diplomatic rift, but whose initiative do you think it is that kind of keep this relationship this way?
I think this crisis is mostly driven by Russia. Yeah, it started with Russia's provocation, let's say, from Russian side, and Azerbaijan has so far been only in the reacting mode. Yeah, so in that regard, I do believe that, unlike some, let's say, so-called in-between states, yeah, between the European Union and Russia, Azerbaijan do have a very diversified foreign policy partnerships. Again, unlike Armenia, even Georgia and Ukraine, Azerbaijan do have very close and recently deepening partnerships with regional major powers, especially Turkey.
Do you think at this point Turkey or even some countries in the Western world will have any sort of leverage to perhaps deprive Russia of another very important ally in the form of Azerbaijan? Or do you think that the proximity of these two countries is still a little too strong?
In the case of Turkey, the leverage is quite big because, again, after Ukraine war, Russia became more dependent on Azerbaijan and hence on Turkey to reach alternative markets in the south, global south. Yeah, and again, as we know, in the case of as Russia stopped gas exports, energy exports, and again even trade ties with the European markets, and it was isolated in the West, it turned its attention to the south and east. So in both directions, Azerbaijan emerged as a key crossroads for Russia to gain access to, again, both Iran and Turkey, which are the main regional powers that Russia is right now diversifying its attention from the West to these countries and also to the Middle East, Gulf Arab countries. So in that context, North-South corridor became very strategic route. And again, Azerbaijan was a pivotal part of that. In the case of the West, I would say that it's quite a little bit uncertain right now because many will depend on the normalization talks between the Trump administration and Russia because it's very unpredictable now. One day there is a kind of rapprochement. Yesterday, Trump had a phone call with Putin and there were some expectations that, again, there could be some quid pro quo over Ukraine and now Trump stopped military supplies to Ukraine. So there is kind of an uncertainty, I'm sure, that will factor in calculations of small countries. Now, I wouldn't say small Azerbaijan is behaving like a middle power, but still, compared to Russia, there is kind of a military and economic asymmetry. And so Azerbaijan, I'm sure that will include it in its calculations that what kind of rapprochement there could be between Russia and the United States. But again, in both cases, I'm sure that Azerbaijan is quite pragmatic, even after all those negative stuff happened with Russia, that Russia is a critical part of its balanced foreign policy. So again, unlike some regional countries, Azerbaijan has never declared its intention to one-sidedly to join any alliances that are against some other rival great powers in the region, whether it's NATO, dominated by the United States, or CSTO dominated by Russia. So I think that formulation will keep on, and what will change will be the bilateral asymmetry between Russia and Azerbaijan signaling that Russia cannot do anything it wants when it comes to Azerbaijan, so it should take into Azerbaijani security interests into account too. So I'm sure that the balance in that asymmetry will be the key factor that will change, and Azerbaijan's probably in favor in the near future.
Right. So like you mentioned, there is an asymmetry when it comes to the powers of the two different countries, but Russia do still need Azerbaijan a lot. In that sense, can you help us paint a picture if the situation, if the relationship continues to deteriorate, how is that going to impact Russia's economy or its ability to skirt some of these sanctions?
Yeah, if we consider that Russia will remain under Western sanctions, it means that Russia is losing a very strategic partner in a very strategic region. Yeah, again, it's very important for Russia to reach. Azerbaijan is very important for Russia to reach Turkey through Baku Tbilisi railway. They can use it, and also the North-South corridor. They can reach to alternative markets, big markets, let's say, such as India. So, as you know, after Russia became sanctioned after Ukraine war, there were significant steps taken in that direction. In 2023 May, there were agreements signed between Russia and Iran that Russia will allocate $1.6 billion to construct the remaining parts of the Rasht-Astara Railroad in Iranian territory. That will make it quite likely that the cargo moving from Russia to India would go smoothly through Azerbaijani and Iranian railways. So in that regard, again, and at the same time, in January 2025, Russia and Iran signed a strategic partnership agreement where it was mentioned that in the discussions, Russia is expected to sell gas to Iranian market, and even through Iranian infrastructure to neighboring countries like Pakistan and India, very large markets. So that pipeline was expected to pass through Azerbaijani territory. In the beginning, it was expected to be 2 billion cubic meters, and later to be upgraded to something like 5 billion. So that shows Russia's efforts to diversify its gas exports away from the European markets, which they are doing also with the Chinese, their Chinese partners. So in that regard, again, both in connectivity-wise and energy diversification efforts, Azerbaijan is a critical node point. And if Russia chooses to escalate relations with Azerbaijan and risk losing its very strategic partner in the region, then it's its own choosing.
Right, so it does not sound very intuitive for Russia to want to pursue this deterioration of diplomatic affairs, which brings me to something that does perplexes some of us, that the recent provocation and a lot of these arrests dates back to like 20 years ago. Why this timing? And seeing that Azerbaijan is so pivotal for Russia right now, why risk these provocations?
There can be two interesting theories about it. One is domestic. Again, we see that especially recently, in the last 3 years after Ukraine war, there is this rising power of hardliners and nationalists in the influence of a Russian foreign policy that shape Russia's behavior toward its neighbor. It's not the first time it's happening in a post-Soviet neighboring country. Last year and this year, even similar incidents happened against migrants and ethnic minorities from Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. We see that this was also there was also a similar argument in 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea. There was Putin was mobilizing all this nationalist support to gain support to its war of aggression against Ukraine. But on the other side, the rising influence, rising clout of these nationalist forces in Russian foreign policy push Russia make irrational moves against its neighbor. As you said, it's very irrational for Russia to isolate and alienate a very strategic partner like Azerbaijan, especially in this kind of sensitive situation. So I do believe that it's in some part domestic driven, and a rising role of hardliners in foreign policy making, and the influence over Putin, who is quite restrained and sometimes, especially toward countries like Azerbaijan and Turkey, the proponent of constructive relations. But now it is not the case anymore. The second one is, I think, the changing power balances in the South Caucasus, and Russia may see that, again, both Azerbaijan and in Armenia, we see that is going openly against Russian interests in the region. And unlike Azerbaijan, they are openly, deliberately passing Russia's red lines, crossing Russia's red lines by saying that, okay, we are interested in EU integration, which Azerbaijan never said. it's interested in EU integration or NATO membership. So in that regard, it's both domestic factors, again, rising role of hardliners and changing power balances in the South Caucasus, again, Azerbaijan and Armenia's, let's say, preference for non-Russian platforms to solve their problems, whether it's peace agreement or opening of the transport corridors between the two countries, involving, again, alternative paths Russia considers enemies and key threats to its special interests in the region.
Right, so whether things will stabilize or this is a sign of a broader change, only time will tell. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Moldova wants EU membership talks to begin in earnest before its September election. But with Hungary blocking Ukraine's path, Brussels is struggling to move forward without leaving Kyiv behind.
Moldovan officials are urging the EU to open real accession negotiations ahead of the country's parliamentary vote on September 28. Deputy Prime Minister Kristina Gerasimov warns that delays are playing into the hands of Russian disinformation campaigns, which falsely claim Brussels has no intention of welcoming Moldova into the bloc. Both Moldova and Ukraine were granted candidate status in 2022 and formally launched talks last year. But Hungary's ongoing veto against Kyiv has stalled any substantive progress. EU diplomats now face a dilemma: how to reward Moldova's democratic reforms without appearing to sideline war-torn Ukraine. With the first ever EU-Moldova summit set for Friday in Chisinau, European leaders must decide between symbolic gestures or risking the credibility of the enlargement promise altogether.
Russia has formally recognized the Taliban government in Afghanistan. It's the biggest diplomatic win yet for the isolated Islamist regime.
The Russian government has officially accepted the Taliban-appointed ambassador in Moscow, effectively recognizing the Taliban as Afghanistan's legitimate rulers. Russia becomes the first major power to normalize diplomatic relations since the group seized Kabul in 2021. The decision is expected to boost the Taliban's international standing, even as the regime remains under UN sanctions for human rights abuses. Western governments have condemned the move, warning it could embolden other authoritarian regimes seeking legitimacy.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.